Thank you, Greg, and thank you to the roundtable for inviting me. I'm going to be talking about a whole variety of different issues. I don't have solutions to any of them. I'm going to throw up a lot of thoughts and possibilities, and I hope that it'll help stimulate discussion for the rest of the morning, at least, if not the day. These are my disclosures. So the evolution of direct-to-consumer genetic testing, in terms of its scope, and to my mind, it really breaks down into four major areas, which is talking about ancestry, personal traits, multifactorial genetic risk scores, like type 2 diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, or Crohn's disease, and then Mendelian disorders, such as hereditary breast and ovarian cancer, and recently, for example, cardiomyopathy being made available through direct-to-consumer testing. I want to talk a little bit about the limitations, uptake. We have a survey that I'll share with you about why people undertake direct-to-consumer testing, provider perceptions, and then something about hybrid models for direct-to-consumer testing. So ancestry and personal traits, I see this as really being the 4 E's here, which is engagement, entertainment, enlightenment, and enlistment people into research. And I can't resist just telling you a story, which is I was on a plane yesterday, flying here in seat 21C, and I feel a tap on my shoulder, and there's the woman who was sitting in 22D, and she had a direct view of my laptop where I was working on a talk, and she said, "Oh, genetics." And I said, "Yeah." She said, "I did my ancestry thing, and my dad was black and my mother was white, and I am 40% African in origin and 60% European. And that must explain why I've never really identified with African Americans." I'm thinking to myself, well, all right, let's talk about this a little bit. I mean, you're not 40% from your dad, you're 50. It may not be 50% of African inheritance, but you're 50% from your dad, and the fact that you grew up in Scotland might have something to do with your, and then she later on tells me that her husband is black, is African American, and so we had this long discussion about, what you're calling race. This is something that happens due to the culture and the society and every other place that you're growing up in. And it's not determined by this genetic test. And yet the power of this genetic test on her psyche was so strong that she thought it explained an entire lifelong inclination that she had as to how she self-identified. It could have, I thought it was the kind of thing that you could not make it up. And we had a very nice conversation. And she left our, as the plane was about to land. She stood there for about an hour in the aisle. We were talking, and she left when we were about to sit down. And she had a whole course in human genetics on United Airlines Flight 309. Okay. So in addition to ancestry and personal traits, there's the multifactorial genetic risk scores, and there are questions about the clinical utility of such scores, which I can mention just briefly. And then, of course, there's single gene disorders, some of which have heterogeneity and some don't, like thrombophilia, which has a few variants that are particularly well known in a few genes, versus some of the other disorders where there's a lot of genes that can contribute and many, many different variants that can contribute to those conditions. So here's an example there was I don't know if any of you attended it, but there was this really interesting talk by Teresa Morto, who is somebody I really admire and whose work I really admire, she's a genetics specialist, sociologist, psychologist, I'm not sure what term to use, from the United Kingdom. And she has published a lot of papers about the role of genetics in motivating behavior. And this was one paper she wrote about the effect of communicating DNA-based risk assessments for Crohn's disease on getting people to stop smoking, which we know is a contributor to Crohn's disease. So it was a randomized controlled trial of the relatives of people with Crohn's disease who were all tested, some of whom were tested, some of which were not. And the bottom line of the trial was that they asked how many stopped smoking for at least 24 hours or longer. And it really didn't differ between the arms of the people who got DNA results versus the people who didn't get any DNA results, and the people who got a elevated risk by their DNA results versus a non-elevated risk by DNA results. And Teresa in recent ASHG went over a number of different other multifactorial conditions where there's some lifestyle modifications or other sorts of modifications. And when put to test and put to trial, the genetic risk scores from these tests really didn't seem to change or motivate most behavior across the board. I'm sure there are individuals, I remember, I think Francis talked about taking a genetic risk score for type 2 diabetes, and as a result, he got up on an elliptical and lost lots of weight, and I think he's kept it off. So there are some people who are motivated by it. For Mendelian disorders, it really depends to some extent on what test is being done. The most common, of course, is individual variants. And I'm showing you this for a reason. So this is a 24 variant screen for familial hypercholesterolemia, where there are some LDLR variants that are more common than others in certain populations. And what we did at Invitae was to say, all right, let's just do a thought experiment. Suppose we took every patient who was referred for testing for familial hypercholesterolemia, and that's the FH indication cohort. And then let's look at all the people who have had testing done as part of a sort of a genetic risk. These are unaffected people who did not have any particular reason to think or know that they had familial hypercholesterolemia. And the thought experiment was what fraction of them would have been picked up by the 24 variant screen. And you can see that for the cohort results, for a full diagnostic test, in other words, full gene sequencing, about 1/3 of people who were referred for that testing were positive. So 2/3 were negative. For the partial 24 variant screen, 8.5% were positive, and 91.5% were negative. So there's a significant difference in the yield between a full sequencing and a variant dependent. But it's really the other that I think is sort of puts things in perspective for me, and that is for the healthy cohort, the positive who had a full diagnostic test was 0.7%, which is about what you expect based on what we know is the general allele frequency of deleterious variants in LDLR and ApoB, et cetera. It's about 1 in 110 or 1 in 150 people, something like that. Whereas for the partial 24 variant screen, the positive was 0.2%. So once again, it was a threefold difference. But I think it's important to keep in mind, if someone is having the direct-to-consumer testing done for some other reason, such as ancestry or traits or some other reason for themselves, to throw on a medically relevant test in that setting, once they're already getting the testing, does succeed in identifying some people who are just simply not aware that they're at risk for having a mutation in LDLR. And so, you could say, well, on the left, there's a really substantial difference in the yield. And on the right, yes, there's also a substantial difference in the yield, but both are really, really small. I wanted to also use this example. MUT-YH is also being offered but with variant-specific detection. And for a form of autosomal recessive polyposis. Being a carrier for MUT-YH deleterious mutations has sort of a minimal clinical utility. There's some indication that if you have a relative who has colorectal cancer and you're heterozygote for a MUT-YH mutation, you probably should have earlier and perhaps more frequent colonoscopies, although you probably should have earlier and more frequent colonoscopies if you have a relative, whether or not you're a carrier of MUT-YH. But anyway, so we looked at a group of 270,000 patients referred by healthcare providers for gene testing for a variety of different cancers, but that included MUT-YH. And we stratified it by self-reported ethnicity. And this is really the point I wanted to make, is that we had almost 6,000 patients had a pathogenic or likely pathogenic variant MUT-YH, and of those, 4,500 had one of the Northern European variants, which are the one that's on the variant-specific DTC panel. But by ethnicity, the ascertainment was incomplete in 100% for Asians. The Asians don't carry this variant. 3/4 of African Americans would not have been picked up. So in other words, 3/4 of the African Americans who had a deleterious mutation in MEAT-YH did not have one of these that's on the DTC panel. A little less than half of all Hispanics and about 1/3 of all Caucasians. So the variant-specific DTC is, depending on what gene and what variants you're talking about, can have very widely different yields depending on the ethnic background of the people involved. So what are the routes to obtaining genetic testing? There are really, as far as I can see, 3 basic routes. One is traditional healthcare provider-initiated service delivery. You go to the doctor who says, you know, I think you need a genetic test, or I think I'm going to refer you to a genetic counselor, then I think you need a genetic test. Or direct-to-consumer, where there's no physician involvement at all. And then there are hybrid models, where they're consumer-driven, but there is physician involvement. And these are some of the models, for example, that Helix is using, that Invitae is using. So it's been, Catherine Phillips wrote a very nice editorial or description in JAMA describing these so-called hybrid models. So this is kind of the way things work. I thought it's to my best ability to describe it. So the traditional model is the provider evaluates the patient and offers pre-test education and then orders the testing. The laboratory performs the test. The lab results go to the ordering provider and the patient is referred for appropriate follow-up based on test results. So that's the model that we're all familiar with. And the pure DTC is the consumer chooses the test using an online pre-test education. Laboratory performs the test. The lab results go to the patient, and there's a lot of web-based educational material available to the individual to help understand and understand what's next. But then a positive test needs to be confirmed in a clinical testing laboratory, and a negative test may need clinical testing as well, depending on the patient's indication and family history and personal history and whatever. So it's really a different species altogether. And then there's a hybrid model where a consumer chooses the test using online pre-test education. And a provider, however, reviews the patient information and signs on the order. So there is a physician involvement in reviewing the test and signing off on it. The laboratory performs the test, and the lab results go to the patient and any provider that the patient indicates he or she would like it to go to, and then the patient's referred for appropriate follow-up based on test results. So there's physician involvement, but it's the first step, that first step of the consumer choosing the test using online pre-test education that is what makes this a hybrid, a mixture between these 2 different models. So why develop a hybrid model? There are roadblocks to accessing clinically valid genetic testing. There's provider scarcity, which leads to very long wait times. We've heard of people who have been given an appointment to go see a genetic counselor. That's 6 months in advance. There's a lot of provider discomfort, particularly with non-genetic specialists who now have been pulled into the genetic testing arena. I don't want to pick on any particular specialty, but for example, urologists now know that prostate cancer has a significant importance for knowing whether there's a homologous recombination defect mutation, and yet they could see 4 patients in the time it takes them to do pre-test counseling, and they're really not comfortable with it. Not to mention the fact that they're not comfortable with, if they're urologists who are dealing primarily with prostate cancer, with having to worry about BRCA1 and 2 testing in female relatives of their male patients. The testing guidelines are very slow to change, and this is a real barrier. We've had patients, for example, come to us frustrated and angry because they know, for example, a nurse knows that her 22-year-old son, who died of a dissecting thoracic aortic aneurysm, that he needs a genetic evaluation. And her physician said, what's the point? What good is it going to do? And yet she then went to the medical examiner, got the sample, got sent to us, and he had a mutation in a gene that causes dissection of the thoracic aortic aneurysm, which was then found not to be present in his younger sister or in either parent. So it was a new mutation in him. So yeah, there is good that can come from it. And she was extremely frustrated. And we were thinking there are other patients that are coming up against the traditional medical care system where genetics is not understood. The last time anybody heard any genetics was their first or second year of medical school, and that could have been 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. And that I'd say in many ways, the development of the hybrid model and the thirst for direct-to-consumer is in part an indictment of the current medical care system and its role in knowledge and understanding of genetics. The cost of testing, that's coming down. There's been a barrier in the past, and insurance has been setting up barriers to ordering a test, sort of making themselves the gatekeepers. And also a lot of logistical barriers, which the direct-to-consumer companies have been very good at lowering and reducing and using modern techniques of both web-based and cell phones, et cetera, smartphones. So what are the reasons to consider the hybrid model? You want to engage with and don't ignore the providers. I mean, I think in some sense the direct-to-consumer often just says, look, let's just keep the physicians out of it. Instead, the hybrid model is attempting to engage with them, even if they're not doing the initiating. It's sort of grabbing them by the hand and pulling them along. It limits the gatekeeping role of payers, with patients saying that I can't get this test because my insurance won't cover it. Well, it's actually not that expensive, and you can pay for it yourself. At least some people can. It's not, cheap by any means. And you can streamline the process of getting testing done. So this is a survey of consumer attitudes towards pure DTC medical testing and the hybrid clinical grade models. So this was a survey that we did and pulled together the top motivations for purchasing a DTC test. And what's interesting is the number one was diagnostic testing. 52% said they had gone for a direct-to-consumer test for diagnostic purposes, whereas 49% said it was for ancestry and heritage. I was very struck by that. Now, this may represent some bias of ascertainment in the people who chose to answer the survey, but still, I think it's kind of remarkable. The average number of reasons given per person for genetic testing was 4.4. So there were lots of others, pre-symptomatic or predictive testing, proactive health testing, carrier testing, self-exploration, non-health, nutrition or diet, et cetera. So, however, I think there are a lot of paradoxical concerns regarding genetic risk screening by this new hybrid direct-to-consumer testing model, which makes it different from the pure direct-to-consumer. There were privacy concerns raised. I mean, despite the fact that well over 10 million people have had direct-to-consumer testing, it's obvious that they have been their privacy concerns have been assuaged, and yet with this hybrid DTC testing model that has physician involvement and is giving clinical grade results, I think people have a heightened concern. It's almost as if, yeah, we recognize that in fact this testing that we're getting is more serious. It's the same sort of testing I would have gotten if I just went to my doctor and my doctor had ordered it. So now it's serious. And so their privacy concerns are greater. There's a misperception of actionability and reticence in taking this kind of genetic test. They want to, in a sense, they have to take it more seriously. And so there's a psychological burden of unhappy or even terrifying knowledge. There's also skepticism about the quality of the result. A lot of the new companies that are offering this, they're concerned that are they real? And I call this the Theranos effect. And finally, the lack of insurance coverage reduces medical credibility. If an insurance company is not going to pay for this, and yet you say that it's a real medical test, it's not something that I'd have to run off and get it confirmed. It's for real. Why is insurance not willing to pay for it? And there's some real fear among consumers around several recurring issues. fear of having their genetic information existing out there in the ether. These are all based on interviews with these patients. This is all qualitative research that we did. Identifying pre-existing conditions that their insurance won't cover, the testing companies selling their data to unauthorized third parties, government or law enforcement agencies getting their hands on their data, and bad actors using their data for nefarious purposes. So in summary, I found a lot of interesting paradoxes in the interface between hybrid testing, the pure direct-to-consumer, and the medical care system. There's obviously a thirst for this information. People are not quite sure how best to get it. You'd think that they would be more reliant on their own physicians for it, and yet I think there's some concern. And then finally, I should say, is that everybody has a different opinion about this. And so you can't sort of talk about the consumer. They're all over the place. There's this huge spectrum of attitudes and concerns about it. And that's, I think, has to be taken into account. So I hope that's helpful for raising a bunch of issues and things that will provoke some thought. And I'm sorry for running over slightly.
I think we have about 5 minutes for clarifying questions. So anybody want to step up to the microphone? Kathy. Oh, sure.
Bob, can you be more explicit about the provider or physician that's involved in the testing, just for everybody to be on the same page? So if you're, if it's consumer driven and you pick out the test in the hybrid, who is that physician? Is it a physician at the company? Is it your own personal physician? Can it be either? If you could just elaborate on that.
So there are different models. Currently, I can just tell you the way Invitae does it. There are other companies that may do it somewhat differently. We make a distinction between people that are using a genetic health screen and people that have an indication for testing, either a personal history or a family history. If they have an indication for testing, we refer them to another company that's not part of Invitae that offers pre-test counseling and then follow-up afterwards. In essence, what we're saying is, yeah, you've initiated the test, but you really have an indication for genetic testing, and we're going to help you connect with a bona fide provider. It can be a local provider or it can be a company that does it by telehealth, but one way or the other. For the people that are looking for a genetic health screen, the pre-test counseling there is primarily educational material, and then it's overseen by a company, PWN, that signs off on reviews the information and can say something like, you know what, given your personal history or your family history, I think it'd be best if you went the other route. So there's kind of a fork in the road. That's the way we've designed it. It's a bit clunky, and maybe it won't work. I don't know. We've just launched it and we're trying it. I have to say that probably our biggest motivation has been the number of people that have called up our client services just frustrated out there wazoo with being unable to get genetic testing that they feel they need and they should have. So it's frustration with the current established medical system that is driving it. Yeah.
Matt Ferber. I'm Matt Ferber from Mayo Clinic and Mayo Clinic Gene Guide. Yeah. Just to add to that last comment, Bob, we use PWN Health as well, and one of our real benefits is that they offer a network of physicians that can operate in all 50 states. So, if we wanted to internalize that pre-test counseling and authorization of the test, we would need to have physicians at Mayo who are licensed in all 50 states, and it makes it a little bit challenging. Yeah. So that's just a comment. The question I have, though, that was related to your pie chart that showed the difference between diagnostic testing and kind of the, as I call it, the leave no stone unturned approach to both variant acquisition interpretation versus the healthy population. You've mentioned it through your talk, but just at a high level as it relates to that pie chart, can you give us an idea of the cost differential between the left-hand side versus the right-hand side. So if somebody is just casually interested in understanding if they have some type of predisposition, running them through a leave no stone unturned approach, that's where I think the cost prohibitiveness really starts to show up, and why it is still, even though it's unimpressive, 0.7 and 0.2%, it's still very useful for the general population when, if you happen to find this, then at least I know.
Yeah, so I mean, the prices can be all over the place, and they can change, at a drop of a hat. But sort of the general thing, the impression I have is that a direct-to-consumer medical is about $100, something like that, $99. If someone correct me, I'm sure the people in the audience that don't know better. For a no stone unturned approach, depending on the size of the panel. If you're just doing a cardiovascular panel, that would include the LDLR, it'd be about $250. So, it's more than twice.
Congratulations on your great pricing for your clinical operation. I know. I'm a co-director of our clinical laboratory as well, in addition to our more consumer-oriented product. And I would almost multiply that by 3 or so within our setting. But I understand what you're saying.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah. The prices are just going to keep coming down. Well, I won't get into the issue of the sequencing technology. We'll leave that. But I guess the other thing I should say is that we vetted PWN pretty carefully before we got involved with them to make sure that they had the expertise on board to be able to handle this, and they do. So I'm not concerned about it.
Hi, Emily Edelman, the Jackson Laboratory. Thank
Yes,
you for
hi.
a great presentation. And I really found that consumer survey data also very fascinating. So continuing on this theme of the providers in the hybrid model, do you have a sense, I hear that you've just kind of launched Invitae's hybrid model, but do you have a sense of what the providers in the broader medical community, not the ones who are collaborating to actually provide services to the patients, but what the broader medical community, the frontline providers, what are their attitudes and feelings about the hybrid model to the degree that you've got a sense of that? Yeah,
so the specialists feel that it is an encroachment on their turf, and they would rather not have it. The mainstream people who are being pulled and dragged and kicking and screaming into having to think about genetics, I mean, for example, I don't mean to, as I said, the urologists. What the urologists would love to have, and what they now have with this, is to say to their patient, I think you need genetic testing. Here's a website. Done. And then the patient can then share the report and clinical consult support for the physician as well as for the patient as a result of the test, what to do about it, where to go from there, whatever. So it's all over the map. It really depends a lot on the physician's specialty, their experience, and comfort with genetics. It's all over the place.
Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Thank you.